Today we're going to talk about Sigmund Freud and remember back to Psychology 1 in the first chapter when we were talking about the contemporary perspectives and we talked about the psychodynamic and the psychoanalytic, and that was associated with Freud. We're going to continue to talk about Freud, and this is where some of the interesting things about Freud really comes up. And you can disagree with his theories, you can fight his theories, or you can agree with it. But really today we're going to talk about the stages of psychosexual development, and as it is in the title, it's going to be a lot of sexual references. So just a quick overview on Freud. His lifetime was from 1856 until 1931. He was Austrian. He is most well known for his personality development. So this theory of psychosexual development that we're going to talk about today, it actually has to do with where our personalities are developed and how they were developed through our development cycle. Like other stage theories like Piaget and Erikson, Freud said that completion of the predetermined sequence can result in either successful completion or a healthy personality, or on the other end, can result in failure, which leads to an unhealthy personality. So if we go through it successfully, we will have a healthy personality. If we don't go through it successfully, we will fail and have an unhealthy personality. Freud also defined how human personality develops from our birth to and including early adulthood. So there's only 5 stages that we'll talk about, but they range from birth to death. Freud believed that children experience unconscious sexual fixations as they grow older. And a lot of these stages, the names are going to be about the sexual fixations that children have. He said that these sexual urges change drastically after each stage. And we're going to coin that term pleasure. So just as we talked about with the ego, the superego, and the id, and how Freud was talking about impulses and acting upon what gives us pleasure, during the stages of psychosexual development, we're going to be talking about the erogenous zones of unconscious sexual fixations of children. I know that's going to sound a little weird at first, but again, this is just all of his theories, and all we're doing is understanding what the psychosexual development stages are. Freud also said that without a proper resolution following each stage, we may experience faults in our future personalities, and we will revisit some of that when we talk about each of those stages. So the overview of Freud's psychosexual stages of development. We are going to start at the oral stage, which is the oral fixation. That goes from about 0 to 2. And it says infant achieves gratification through oral activities such as feeding, thumb sucking, and babbling. A lot of the mouth area, the oral area, is what is giving pleasure to this child. Then the second phase is going to be the anal stage, and that's going to be from approximately age 2 to age 3. This is the potty training stage. The child learns to respond to some of the demands of society, such as the bowel and bladder control. And if you remember in Erikson's stage, we kind of talked about the same thing, where what do we learn in terms of personality and development in that potty training stage of development. Following the anal stage is going to be the phallic stage, which goes from about age 3 to age 7. This is where the child learns to realize the difference between males and females and becomes aware of sexuality. This is where gender starts to be recognized, and we start saying, oh, a son might see mom as being different because body parts are different, and then see dad as shaving and understand, oh, this is what guys do. So this is where gender really comes into play. Then follows the stage of latency, which is the school age. This ranges from age 7 to 11, and this is where the child continues his or her development, but sexual urges are relatively quiet. They're focusing on themselves, whether it be academic or athletics or personality, just development. Then finally, which is the long gap, is the genital stage, which goes from age 11 to adulthood. And that's a huge gap. And so, how does Freud define that? He says that the genital stage is where the growing adolescent shakes off old dependencies and learns to deal maturely with the opposite sex. So, that whole adulthood phase from 11 to adult is where we're maturing and understanding kind of the opposite sex. All right, so we're going to continue to talk. Oh, sorry, one more slide. Um, Keep in mind that you guys will feel it and understand this, but this is one of the most highly controversial theories in psychology and maybe in many other theories as well. Freud believed that we develop through these stages based on the particular erogenous zones. Like I was telling you, the oral, the anal, all of those different parts are erogenous and, again, pleasure seeking that really work hand in hand with some of his theories of impulses and superego. During each stage, an unsuccessful completion means that a child becomes fixated on that particular erogenous zone and either over or underindulges once he or she becomes an adult. So there's a spectrum, really. And if we think of like a number line with 0 being in the middle, 10 or positives being on the right hand side, and the negatives being on the left hand side, if we overindulge on the positive end or if we underindulge on the negative end, we are not going through a successful completion. So Freud really talked about how we needed to be balanced and successfully complete each stage in order to have a good personality or a developed personality. So when we think of the first stage, this is our oral stage, and this is about birth to, we're going to go with the 18 months because there's a lot of developmental things that kind of cap at 18. And so as you can see from this picture, I mean, birth to 18, there's a lot of that oral fixation, sucking, sucking thumbs, finding the mouth and playing with the mouth. You see little kids who put their foot in their mouth because they're noticing their whole world is kind of with that the mouth and the oral stage. They're babbling, they're cooing, all again finding pleasure in communicating orally, in feeding. All of that's going to correlate with the oral stage. What does Freud say? Well, the mouth is the infant's primary erogenous zone. So during the oral stage, everything is correlated with the mouth, meaning that the oral cavity is where liberal energy is most focused. It brings the most pleasure to the child. The child gains pleasure through sucking and eating. The child ultimately develops a sense of comfort through oral stimulation. You see children or infants who are sucking on a pacifier. That gives them comfort for that oral stimulation. The child eventually becomes or must become less dependent on caretakers as it grows. So between birth to 18 months, they're fully dependent on the caretaker, but they're starting to learn how to be a little bit more independent and less dependent. In theory, an infant who is neglected or underfed or overprotected, overfed, may become orally fixated with the onset of adulthood. And it's really funny because I've shared this with you before that Freud is often seen having a cigar in his hand. So he has an oral fixation, which we can kind of look into if we'd like. He said fixation in this stage may result in issues with dependency and aggression. The fixation can lead to issues with eating, drinking, smoking, like Freud, and even obsessive habits like nail biting, chewing on pencils. Anytime in our adult stage or after the oral stage, post 18 months, people have a fixation with their oral area, their mouth. Freud would say that there was improper or unsuccessful completion of this oral stage. If the child is not able to successfully resolve his or her sexual urges in the oral stage, then the child will not be able to move on to the next stage of psychosexual development, which is the anal stage. So how does this correlate to personality? Well, Freud would say that individuals may become overly dependent on others. They might be gullible and perpetual followers. The other extreme of it is that they may also fight these urges and develop pessimism and aggression towards others. So, this would be unsuccessful completion of the oral stage, that it could either result to overly dependent or aggressive. So that was stage one. Stage two is the anal stage, which is 18 months to 3 years, typically known as the potty training years. And according to Freud, he would talk about how the child will feel the most pleasure from eliminating waste, from going to the bathroom, from potty training. So everything kind of correlates around potty training. The anal stage begins near the age of 1 when the child is just beginning to toilet train. The erogenous zone shifts from the oral cavity to the anal region with the realization that going to the bathroom is a pleasurable event. Freud believed that the unconscious mind was going through a conflict during this time. Do I receive the pleasure after going to the bathroom because it's a sense of release, a relief, or do I maintain control and try to hold everything in? So it is that conflict. He also said the id of our unconscious represents the part of our being that finds pleasure in expelling the feces, going to the bathroom, while the ego and the superego signify culture's pressure to resist succumbing to bodily functions. So it is about that self-control, and we talked about this with Erik Erikson's stages about control and potty training. So the reoccurring theme within the anal stage is self-control. Two things can go wrong in this stage: too much control or too little control, and both leads to anal fixation. If parents exhibit either of these extremes during toilet training, the child may grow up to be either anally expulsive or anally retentive. And you guys have all heard anal retention, or somebody who is anal. We talked about, right? So what does that mean? Well, anally expulsive means they are limited. There are limited levels of self-control. They're defiant. They're hostile. They're disorganized and scattered brain. Kind of the messy slob type of a kid, if you will. If they are anally retentive, they are rigid. They are obsessively organized. They are overly subservient to authority. So this would not be seen necessarily in the ages of the anal stage. So if somebody is anally expulsive or anally retentive, this could be in the adulthood. So if Freud would see somebody who was extremely hostile and extremely disorganized and defiant, as an adult, he would say, oh, that person must have been anally expulsive in the anal stage of their life, which was in the 18 months to 3 years. And then on the opposite end, if he saw someone who was extremely rigid, obsessively organized, obsessive compulsive, overly subservient, he would say, oh, that person must have been anally retentive in the 18 months to 3 years. So he's saying that these things show up later in our personality.